Vetha woke choking on smoke that wasn't there. Her hands were already moving, clawing at the bedroll, pulling the thin thermal blanket away from her throat, before her mind caught up to the fact that the fire was 12 years gone. No smoke, no burning nursery, no screaming infants in the creche. Just the hum of the transport crawler's engine beneath her spine and the pale green glow of the nav console across the cabin. She sat up, pressed her palm flat against her sternum until her pulse settled from a gallop to something closer to a walk. The nightmare always ended the same way, the creche door buckling inward, the heat pressing against her face like a living thing, and the sound, that thin, reedy sound of a child she hadn't been fast enough to reach. 12 years, and it still came for her every few nights. The crawler lurched. Something heavy shifted in the cargo bay behind the bulkhead, and Vetha heard a small voice say, very clearly, "Ow." She was on her feet before the word finished. Through the partition hatch, past the supply crates and the water drums, to the narrow sleeping nook where a human child was sitting up in a nest of blankets, rubbing the back of his head where it had struck the wall. "Bump," the boy said. He looked up at her with dark eyes that were too calm for a child who'd been thrown into a wall. "Big bump." "I felt it," Vetha said. She crouched until her eyes were level with his. Her knees protested. She was tall for a Kethari woman, nearly 7 feet, and the crawler's ceiling hadn't been designed for her species. "Did you hit hard?" The boy, Combe, 6 years old, human, and technically a ward of the Provisional Refugee Authority until somebody figured out what to do with him, touched the back of his skull with careful fingers and then held them out for her inspection. "No blood," he smiled. "Just a bump," he said again, as though the repetition settled the matter. Vetha exhaled. "Stay in your blankets, I need to check the terrain scanner." She straightened, banged her head on a conduit, swore in Kethari, and made her way back to the cockpit. Through the forward viewport, the ash plains stretched in every direction, a vast, flat expanse of pale gray dust under a sky the color of old bone. The crawler's tracks cut twin lines behind them into the distance. Ahead, nothing. The kind of nothing that went on for 800 kilometers. The terrain scanner was flashing amber. Subsurface fissure, the readout said. Depth unknown. The crawler's autopilot had swerved to avoid it, which explained the lurch. Vetha adjusted the route, adding 12 kilometers to their detour, and leaned back in the pilot's seat. Behind her, she could hear Combe talking to something. She turned. He was talking to a boot. Specifically, he was talking to Vetha's spare boot, which he had propped upright on a crate and wrapped in a scrap of cloth so it looked vaguely like a hooded figure. He was explaining to the boot, with great seriousness, that they were going to cross a desert, and that the boot should not be afraid because Vetha knew what she was doing. "She's very tall," Combe told the boot. "She can see far." Vetha turned back to the viewport so the boy wouldn't see her expression. 3 weeks. She'd had him for 3 weeks, and in that time he had named her spare boot Sergeant, befriended a species of sand beetle that lived in the crawler's wheel wells, the loud ones, and memorized the exact pitch of every alarm on the console so he could hum along when they triggered. She had not planned any of this. What she had planned was a simple extraction run. Fly to the processing center on Urath 4, collect a group of Kethari refugees cleared for resettlement on an axis, and transport them across 2 systems to the colony waiting for them. Standard contract work. She'd done dozens of runs like it for the authority since the border collapse, since the war had ended and left 3 million displaced persons scattered across the charred remains of 8 worlds, and somebody had to move them. The processing center on Urath 4 had been chaos. 1,200 refugees crammed into a facility built for 400. Kethari families, mostly her own people, lavender-skinned and silver-haired and exhausted. But mixed in among them were others. Species from worlds Vetha had never visited. And children. So many children without parents, without papers, without anyone who could say with certainty where they belonged. Combe had been sitting on the floor of the intake hall when she'd found him. Not crying. not calling for anyone, just sitting with his knees drawn up, watching the room with those dark, steady eyes, as though he'd already decided that the world was a place where things happen to you and the best strategy was to pay attention. He was the only human in the facility. The intake officer, a Jorovan with 4 arms and an expression of permanent fatigue, told Vetha that the boy had arrived on a refugee barge 3 days prior. No parents, no guardians, no identification except a medical bracelet with his name and species. The barge's manifest listed his origin world as Senna 9, a human agricultural colony that had been in the path of the Kethari advance. The colony had been evacuated, mostly. "He won't be on your manifest," the intake officer said. "He's flagged for a human resettlement facility, but the nearest one is in the Calax system, and we don't have transport authorization for that route. He'll have to wait." "How long?" "Could be weeks, could be months. The human consulate is overwhelmed. They're prioritizing family reunifications." Vetha had looked at the boy sitting on the floor. He was watching a cleaning drone navigate around his knees, his head tilting to follow its path with the kind of focused curiosity that suggested he was working out how the thing operated. "He can ride with me," she'd said. The words came out before she'd thought them through. "I'm running the Anaxis route. Calax is a 2-day deviation. I can drop him." The intake officer had stared at her. "You're Kethari." "Yes. He's human. I can see that." The fostering paperwork alone then started. And so Vetha had acquired a temporary ward, a small, quiet human child who fit inside her world with the unsettling ease of water filling a crack in stone. He did not take up much space. He ate what she ate, mostly. Human stomachs rejected Tava root. She'd learned, in a memorable incident she preferred not to revisit. He slept when she told him to sleep, woke when she woke, and spent his waking hours conducting a detailed and ongoing investigation of every object on the crawler. The Calax deviation had turned into a Calax impossibility on day 4, when the fuel depot at Resh Station had informed her that the Calax lane was closed. Debris field, weapons remnants from the final battle, no transit for civilian vessels until the sweepers cleared it, estimated 6 standard weeks. 6 weeks. Vetha had stood at the fuel depot's comms terminal, comb sitting on her boot and playing with a piece of wire, and stared at the schedule board as route after route blinked from green to amber to red. The war was over, but its wreckage was everywhere, and the wreckage didn't care about one small boy who needed to get to a resettlement facility. She'd called the authority. The authority had put her on hold for 90 minutes and then told her what she already knew. No alternative transport available. All human resettlement facilities east of the line were at capacity, and the boy's file was in a queue. She should proceed to Anaxis with her Kethari passengers, offload them, and then, if she was willing, continue overland to the provisional processing hub at Kethai City, where the human consulate maintained a small liaison office. Overland across the ash plains, in a cargo crawler. 900 kilometers of dust and silence, with a child who talked to boots. She'd said yes. The Kethari passengers, 18 of them, 3 families, all bound for the farming settlement at Anaxis, had been offloaded 4 days ago. Vetha had watched them walk down the ramp into bright morning light, watched the settlement coordinator lead them toward rows of prefab shelters and newly tilled soil, watched them disappear into their new lives. One of the women had turned back and looked at Combe, standing in the crawler's doorway, his hand resting on Vetha's wrist. "That one's not Kethari," the woman had said, not unkindly. "No," Vetha had said. "Whose is he?" Vetha had paused. She'd felt the boy's small fingers tighten on her wrist, not clinging, not desperate, just holding on, like gravity, like something that just happened because it was the nature of things. "Mine," she'd said, "for now." Now, 4 days into the overland crossing, the crawler ground its way across the ash plains and Vetha ground her teeth and wondered what she was doing. She was not a foster parent. She was not a social worker. She was a transport contractor with a cargo crawler, a fuel allocation, and a temporary custody document that had been signed by an intake officer who could barely stay awake. She was a woman who had failed to save the children in the creche 12 years ago, and who had spent every year since then making sure she was never responsible for a child again. And yet, Combe appeared at the cockpit entrance. He had Sergeant the Boot under one arm and a sand beetle on his shoulder. "Vetha," he said, "the loud ones are hungry. The sand beetles eat silica dust. There's an entire desert outside. But these are inside sand beetles. They eat inside food. There is no such thing as inside food for sand beetles." Combe considered this. "Can I give them a cracker?" "You may give them one cracker, one." He vanished. Vetha heard the cracker tin open, heard the precise snap of one cracker being broken, heard him narrating the feeding process to Sergeant. A minute later he was back. "Vetha, there's a light." She sat up. "Where?" "Outside on the ground, blinking." She looked. 100 meters to the east, half buried in the ash, something was pulsing with a faint amber light. Regular intervals, mechanical. Vetha stopped the crawler and ran the scanner. The reading came back clean, no ordnance, no energy weapon signature. Just a small power source, consistent with a civilian emergency beacon. She went out. The beacon was standard galactic relief issue, a palm-sized disc designed to be activated by refugees to mark their position for search teams. It was scratched, dented, and had been broadcasting for what the battery indicator suggested was at least 2 weeks. Nobody had come. She picked it up and turned it over. On the back, someone had scratched letters into the metal with a sharp object. Kethari script. She read it and her jaw tightened. "Children 14 walking east. Water gone, please." Vetha looked east. The ash plain stretched to the horizon, blank and pitiless. She brought the beacon back to the crawler, logged its coordinates and the message into the nav console's emergency relay, which would bounce the data to the nearest authority listening post when the crawler passed within range. It was the best she could do. The children the beacon spoke of were 2 weeks gone. They had either been found by someone else, or they had not been found at all. Either way, they were beyond her reach. She sat in the pilot's seat and stared at the scratched message until Combe climbed into her lap. "What did it say?" he asked. "It said someone needed help." "Did they get it?" "I don't know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand on her arm, her scarred arm, the one the fire had blistered, where the skin had healed thick and tight, and said, "Maybe they did." "Maybe they did." She filed the beacon's data, set the crawler moving again, and carried the weight of maybe with her across the next 50 kilometers, where it settled alongside the other weights she carried. The 31 names, the commendation medal under the socks, the smell of smoke that wasn't there. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The nightmare came again. It always came in the quiet moments. The creche on Vethara Prime, where she had worked as a care attendant for 3 years before the Kethari bombing campaign began. 42 children under her watch. 42 small lives sleeping in rows of cots with their names written on the frames in colored ink. When the incendiary hit the eastern wing, she had been in the western corridor, inventorying supplies. She'd run. She'd pulled 11 children out through the emergency hatch before the ceiling came down. She'd gone back for more, and the fire had driven her out, blistering the skin on her arms and her face. 31 children. She had not reached 31 children. The official inquiry had cleared her. Exemplary conduct under impossible conditions, the report had said. The commendation medal sat in a drawer in her quarters on Kethar Station, underneath a pair of socks where she didn't have to see it. The terrain scanner pinged. Another fissure. Vetha opened her eyes, adjusted the route, and drove on. They crossed 200 kilometers that day. The ash plains were not featureless, They only appeared that way from altitude. Up close, the dust hid a landscape of shallow ravines, wind-carved ridges, and the occasional ruin of a pre-war settlement, its walls half buried and its windows staring like empty eye sockets. Vetha navigated around each obstacle with the careful precision of someone who understood that a broken axle out here meant a 3-day wait for rescue, if rescue came at all. Colm spent the day at the rear viewport watching the planes pass. He had found a piece of charcoal from the heating elements maintenance kit and was drawing on the viewport's small figures, stick-like, marching across the glass in a procession. A tall one with long hair, a short one with round eyes, a boot with a hood. "That's us," he said when Vetha came to check on him. He pointed. "That's you, that's me. That's Sergeant, we're walking. We're driving. In the picture we're walking, it's more interesting." She looked at the procession of charcoal figures marching across the dusty glass, and something in her chest shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a bone settling back into a socket it had been pushed out of years ago. "Where are we walking to?" she asked. Colm thought about it. "Somewhere with trees," he said. "I like trees. Kethari City has trees. Vetha trees are different from human ones. They're blue." "Blue trees." He said it like he was tasting the words. "Okay." Night fell. The crawler's headlamps carved white tunnels through the darkness, and the sky overhead erupted with stars, thick bands of them, dense as spilled salt, because the ash plains had no light pollution and the atmosphere was thin. Colm pressed his face against the viewport and went quiet for the first time all day. "Those are suns," he said after a while. "Like our sun but far away." "Yes." "Do they have people?" "Some of them." "Do the people have trees?" Vetha almost smiled. "Almost. Some of them probably do." He was quiet again. Then, "Vetha, are you taking me to other humans?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. She kept her eyes on the terrain ahead. "Yes. There's a human liaison office in Kethari City. They'll find a placement for you. A human family or a group home or... What if I don't want to go?" The stone sank deeper. "It's where you belong, Colm." "I belong here." He said it simply, without drama, without pleading. A statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he used to tell Sergeant about the desert. "I belong with you." Vetha's hands tightened on the steering column. She didn't answer. After a while, Colm returned to his blankets, curled up with Sergeant, and fell asleep. She drove through the night. The crawler's autopilot could have handled it, but she needed the work, needed the focus, needed something to do with her hands that wasn't thinking about a 6-year-old human boy who had looked at her, and decided, with the unshakable conviction of a child, that she was home. She was not home. She was a transport contractor with a temporary custody document and a nightmare that came every 3 nights. She was not qualified to be anyone's home. Dawn came gray and pale, and with it came trouble. The terrain scanner showed a canyon ahead, not on the charts, which meant it was new. Post-war geological shift, probably. The bombing campaigns had destabilized tectonic plates across half the continent, and the ash plains were still settling. The canyon ran perpendicular to their route, northwest to southeast, and the scanner couldn't find the bottom. Vetha stopped the crawler and got out. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic scent of ash. She walked to the canyon's edge and looked down. It was perhaps 30 meters across and very, very deep. The walls were sheer, clean-cut, as though something had drawn a line in the earth and pulled the 2 sides apart. She walked the edge for half a kilometer in each direction. No narrowing, no natural bridge, no way across with a vehicle that weighed 18 tons. When she returned to the crawler, Colm was sitting on the running board with his legs dangling. Sergeant sat beside him. Both of them were looking at the canyon with identical expressions of thoughtful appraisal, which was unsettling given that one of them was a boot. "It's big," Colm said. "It is. Can we jump it?" "No." Can Sergeant jump it? Sergeant is a boot, Combe. He considered this. Sergeant's not heavy though, light things jump better. She sat beside him on the running board. The canyon stretched before them, its far edge shimmering in the heat. Somewhere down in its depths, loose stones shifted and clattered, the sound traveling upward like a warning, thin and echoing. I was on a farm, Combe said suddenly. Before, on Senna, we had a river. It flooded once and he stopped. His hands went still on his knees. Someone carried me across, through the water. It was up to their chest but only up to my neck because they were holding me high. Vetha waited. He didn't say who had carried him. The silence that surrounded the missing word was the same shape as a parent, an outline where a person used to be. You don't talk about Senna, she said, not a question. There's not much to say. His voice was steady. 6 years old and already fluent in the language of not talking about the things that hurt. It was a farm, then it wasn't. She put her hand on top of his head. His hair was coarse and dark, nothing like Kethari hair, nothing like the silver silk threads she was used to feeling under her palms when she'd cared for the children in the creche. But the shape of a child's skull underneath was the same. Every species, every world, the skull was always small and warm and terrifyingly fragile. We'll find another way across, she said. He nodded, I know. Back at the crawler, she pulled up the nav chart and ran alternatives. South would add 300 kilometers and take them through the glass flats, a region of fused silica from an orbital strike, razor-sharp and impassable. North would add 200 kilometers and take them through what the chart called the hollows, a region of collapsed bunker networks, unstable ground, and unexploded ordnance from the last Kethari push. Neither option was good, but the hollows were at least mapped. Ordnance clearance teams had been through parts of it. There were marked safe corridors. Vetha turned the crawler north. Combe woke when they changed direction. He appeared in the cockpit doorway, sergeant in hand, sand beetles nowhere to be seen. They had, Vetha suspected, escaped back into the wheel wells during the night stop. He looked at the nav chart on the console and then looked at Vetha's face. Problem, he asked. Canyon in the way. We're going around. He nodded, accepting this with the same equanimity he applied to everything. Then he climbed into the co-pilot's seat, which was far too large for him, designed for an adult Kethari, and tucked his feet beneath him. I'll navigate, he announced. You can't read Kethari script. I'll navigate by looking out the window. That's not how navigation works. It's how walking works. You look where you're going. Vetha couldn't argue with the logic, so she didn't try. The dust storm hit 3 hours into the northern detour. It came from the west, a wall of pale gray that swallowed the horizon and rolled toward them with the slow, implacable momentum of something that did not care what was in its path. Vetha saw it on the long-range scanner first, then through the viewport, and had perhaps 4 minutes to prepare. Combe cargo bay now. He didn't argue. He slid out of the co-pilot's seat, grabbed Sergeant, and disappeared through the partition hatch. Vetha sealed the external vents, switched to internal atmosphere, deployed the crawler's anchor spikes, and killed the engine. The crawler shuddered as the spikes drove into the ground, locking them in place. Then the storm arrived. The sound was extraordinary, a continuous roaring hiss, like the planet itself was exhaling through clenched teeth. Dust struck the viewport in sheets so dense that the outside world vanished entirely. The crawler rocked on its suspension. The anchor spikes groaned. In the cargo bay, Combe was sitting against the bulkhead with his blanket pulled up to his chin and Sergeant wedged firmly between his knees. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, with concentration. It's loud, he said. It's a dust storm. They're common on the plains. How long? Could be 2 hours, could be 12. He processed this. What do we do for 12 hours? We wait. Combe looked at Sergeant. Sergeant, being a boot, offered no opinion. I could teach you a song, Combe said. From Senna, we had songs for when the wind came. Vetha sat down across from him. The crawler swayed around them, the storm screaming against the hull. Teach me, she said. He sang. It was a simple melody, a human farming song, the kind of thing that gets passed from parent to child through repetition and muscle memory rather than written notation. The words were in a human language Vetha didn't speak, but the melody was clean and plain, the kind of tune that holds steady against noise. She listened. Then, because he was looking at her with an expectation that was impossible to refuse, she hummed along. Her voice was lower than his, a Kethari register, deeper and more resonant, and the two lines of melody wove together in the close space of the cargo bay, human soprano and Kethari contralto, while the storm tried to bury them. They sang for an hour. Combe taught her 3 songs, correcting her pronunciation with the gentle authority of a 6-year-old who understood that some things must be gotten exactly right. She taught him 1 Kethari lullaby in return, a cradle song from Vethara Prime, the kind the care attendant sang in the creche. She hadn't sung it since the fire. The words came back rough and uneven, catching in places where memory snagged on pain. Combe didn't notice the catching, or if he did, he didn't mention it. He just listened, learned the melody, and sang it back, his human mouth reshaping the Kethari vowels into something new, not wrong, just different. A translation that preserved the feeling while changing the sound. The storm passed after 6 hours. When Vetha retracted the anchor spikes and started the engine, the world outside was transformed. The dust had reshaped the terrain, old ridges buried, new ones carved, the tracks they'd made earlier completely erased. The nav chart was useless. She recalibrated from the stars, found their bearing, and drove on. Combe fell asleep 20 minutes after the storm ended, mid-sentence, his head dropping sideways onto Sergeant. The lullaby she'd taught him was still on his lips. The last 3 notes hummed into silence as sleep took him. Vetha drove in quiet. Her throat ached from singing, and the ache felt good, clean, like a muscle that had been unused for too long and was remembering what it was for. They entered the hollows by mid-morning. The landscape changed. The flat gray dust gave way to undulating terrain, ridged and cratered. Collapsed structures jutted from the earth at odd angles, their metal bones rusting in the dry air. Warning markers, yellow poles with reflective strips, lined the safe corridors, and Vetha kept the crawler precisely between them, reducing speed to a crawl. Combe watched the ruins pass with wide eyes. He did not ask what had happened here. Perhaps he already knew. Perhaps he'd seen enough of war's leftovers on Senna 9 that the sight of collapsed buildings didn't need explanation. Or perhaps he was simply 6, and 6-year-olds accept the shape of the world as it is without needing to know how it got that way. Vetha, he said after 20 minutes of silence. Is that a person? She stopped the crawler, looked where he was pointing. Through the dust haze 50 meters off the safe corridor, a shape was crumpled against the base of a collapsed wall. Vetha reached for the scanner and swept the area. No ordnance signatures, no energy readings, just the shape. She magnified the external camera. The shape resolved into a Kethari woman, lavender skin, silver hair matted with dust, wearing the faded gray of a refugee transit suit. She was curled on her side, not moving. Vetha stared at the display. The safe corridor was clearly marked. Leaving it meant risk, unexploded ordnance, unstable ground, subsurface voids. The woman might be dead already, might have been dead for days. She's not moving, Combe said. His voice was very quiet. Vetha was already pulling on her boots. Stay in the crawler, she told him. Do not open any door. Do not touch any console. If an alarm sounds, you lie flat on the floor and cover your head with the blankets. Understood? Understood. She took the emergency kit and the portable scanner and stepped out. The ground was firm for the first 20 meters, then began to feel hollow, a subtle change in the way the dust compressed under her boots, as though there were empty spaces beneath. She moved slowly, testing each step, the scanner humming in her hand. The woman was alive, barely. Dehydrated exposure, a broken ankle that she had splinted herself with a piece of debris and a strip torn from her sleeve. Her eyes opened when Vetha knelt beside her, and they were clouded with pain but aware. "Transit suit," Vetha said, noting the markings. "You were with a group." The woman's voice was a rasp. "Convoy from the eastern settlements. We were crossing to Kethari. The lead vehicle hit something. Explosion. The convoy scattered. I was walking for 2 days before my ankle gave." "How many in the convoy?" 30 families." "Where are they now?" The woman shook her head. She didn't know. Vetha got her up. The woman, her name was Rahel, and she had been a schoolteacher before the war, could not walk on the ankle, so Vetha carried her. 150 pounds of Kethari woman over 50 meters of possibly mined ground, while the portable scanner beeped its readings, and Vetha placed each foot with the precision of someone who understood that a single wrong step could end both their lives. She made it back to the crawler. Combe had the hatch open, violating her explicit order, and was holding out a water canister. His face was calm, composed, as though rescuing injured women from mined wastelands was a normal part of the morning routine. "This is Rahel," Vetha said, maneuvering through the hatch. "She needs water and the medical kit." "I know." Combe already had the kit open. He held up the tube of antiseptic gel. "This one's for cuts." Vetha settled Rahel on the floor of the cargo bay and went to work on the ankle. It was a clean break, the kind that would heal with immobilization and time. She set it properly, applied the gel to the abrasions, and started an IV of hydration solution from the emergency stores. Rahel watched Combe throughout the process. The boy had appointed himself water bearer and was holding the canister at precisely the right angle for her to drink, tilting it with both hands and a level of concentration that suggested he considered this a matter of great responsibility. "He's human," Rahel said to Vetha, as though Vetha might not have noticed. "Yes. Yours." There it was again, the question that had no clean answer. "He's in my custody temporarily. I'm transporting him to the human liaison office in Kethari City." Rahel looked at the boy. Combe looked back at her with dark, steady eyes, and then he smiled, a small, sudden thing like a light switching on, and said, "I'm Combe. This is Sergeant." He held up the boot. Rahel blinked. Then, despite the pain and the dehydration and the 2 days of walking through a mined wasteland on a broken ankle, she laughed. They drove on. The safe corridor wound through the hollows for another 60 kilometers, and by late afternoon they emerged onto the far side, flat ground again, but different. The ash was thinner here. Beneath it, actual soil, brown and dry but real, and on the horizon a smudge of color that might have been green. Rahel slept in the cargo bay, her ankle elevated on a crate. Combe sat in the co-pilot's seat, as he had all day, and watched the landscape change. He saw the green before Vetha did. "Trees," he said. "Vetha, trees." She looked. The smudge resolved as they approached into a line of vegetation, low, scrubby growth clinging to the banks of a dry riverbed, but alive, growing, reaching for the thin sunlight with leaves that were, as promised, blue. "Blue trees," Combe said. He pressed both hands against the viewport. "You were right." They camped that night at the edge of the vegetation line. Vetha parked the crawler in the shelter of a low ridge, extended the stabilizers, and shut the engine down for the first time in 4 days. The silence was immense, a vast, ringing emptiness that seemed to come from the ground itself, as though the whole plane were holding its breath. Combe collected sand beetles from the wheel wells and released them into the scrub. "They'll like it here," he told Vetha. "There's food. You're releasing your pets into the wild." "They're not pets, they're colleagues." He paused, processing this word which he had clearly picked up from Vetha and was testing in conversation. They have their own jobs, I have mine. And what is your job? Navigator, he pointed ahead into the darkness. That way. Vetha built a fire, with actual combustible material, for the first time on the journey. The blue-leaved scrub burned with a pale flame and a scent like warm metal. She heated rations, fed Combe and Rahel, and sat on the crawler's running board, watching the stars. Rahel had made it to the cargo bay doorway, her splinted ankle propped on a supply drum. She watched the fire and said, "The convoy was headed for Kethari's too, resettlement processing. There were children." Vetha's stomach clenched. How many? 9, 4 families, some unaccompanied. Would they have stayed on the safe corridor? If the vehicles survived the blast, yes. The corridor's the only route, but if they scattered on foot, Rahel trailed off. Vetha stared into the fire. 9 children in the hollows, possibly on foot, possibly walking through unmarked ground, where the things buried beneath the ash did not care how small or how young the feet that found them were. She thought of 31 names written in colored ink on the frames of cots. "We go back," she said. Rahel looked at her. "The hollows are." "I know what the hollows are. The ground is unstable. The crawler weighs 18 tons, if you leave the safe corridor." "I know," Vetha was already standing. "I know all of it. We go back." Combe appeared in the doorway. He had Sergeant. He looked at Vetha's face, and then at the direction they'd come from, and then back at Vetha. He didn't ask why. He climbed into the co-pilot's seat and buckled the harness that was 3 sizes too big for him. "Navigator's ready," he said. They drove through the night, back into the hollows. Vetha moved the crawler at half speed, headlamps flooding the corridor with white light, terrain scanner running continuous sweeps. Rahel sat behind her, ankle elevated, reading the scanner output and calling hazard markers. Combe sat in his seat, watching the ruins pass through the forward viewport, and said nothing. At 300, the scanner picked up heat signatures, multiple, clustered 200 meters north of the corridor. Vetha stopped. "How many?" she asked Rahel. Rahel squinted at the display. "Looks like 12, maybe 15. Some of them are very small." "Are they moving?" "No, huddled. They're sheltering in something, a structure maybe, collapsed bunker." Vetha looked at the scanner's terrain overlay. The 200 meters between the corridor and the heat signatures were flagged amber, possible subsurface voids, ordnance probability unknown. Not red, not guaranteed death, just unknown. She looked at Combe. The boy was watching her with those dark, steady eyes, not afraid, not asking her to go, not asking her to stay, just watching, waiting to see what she would do. "Stay with Rahel," she told him. "Same rules as before." "You come back," Combe said. It wasn't a question, wasn't a plea. A command, delivered with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old who had decided that the universe owed him this one thing. "I come back," Vetha said. She took the emergency kit, the scanner, 2 emergency blankets, the water supply, and a handheld light. She stepped off the safe corridor and into the dark. The first 50 meters were solid ground. The scanner showed clean, no ordnance signatures, no voids. Vetha moved quickly, her long Kethari stride covering the distance in measured steps, the light carving a white cone ahead of her. At 100 meters the ground changed. The hollow feeling returned, the dust compressing too easily, the sense of emptiness beneath. She slowed. The scanner showed a subsurface cavity, an old bunker room, collapsed on one side but partially intact. She skirted its edge, testing each step, feeling the give of the ground beneath her. At 150 meters she heard voices. Small voices. Children's voices, speaking Kethari and 2 other languages she didn't recognize. Calling to each other in the dark, the way children do when they're trying to convince themselves that they're not alone. She found them at 200 meters, huddled inside the shell of a collapsed transport vehicle that had wedged itself into the mouth of a bunker entrance. 15 people, 6 adults, 9 children. 3 of the adults were injured. 2 of the children were very small, small enough that they had to be carried. The group's leader, a Kethari man named Torath, had kept them sheltered here for 2 days, rationing their last water and keeping the children calm by telling stories. "We heard the explosion," Torath said, his voice raw. "The lead vehicle, it hit a buried charge. We tried to stay on the corridor, but the blast threw us off. We drove until the ground gave way and the vehicle dropped into the bunker. We've been here since." "Can you walk?" Vetha asked. "The adults can. Most of them, some of the children can, 2 need to be carried." He hesitated. "We tried to walk out ourselves twice. Both times the ground shifted under us. One of the men, Jarek, stepped on something. It didn't detonate, but we heard it click. We heard the mechanism arm." Torath's hands were shaking. "We backed away, very slowly, very carefully, and we haven't moved since." "Show me where." He pointed. 30 meters from the vehicle, a patch of disturbed dust. Vetha swept it with the scanner. The reading came back hot: a fragmentation mine, anti-personnel Kethari manufacture, armed but not detonated. The pressure plate had engaged, but the firing pin had jammed. Corrosion, probably. 12 years of ash and moisture working on the mechanism. They had been saved by rust. "There are more," Torath said. "Between here and the corridor. We can see the yellow markers from the vehicle's roof. 200 meters. It might as well be 200 kilometers." Vetha looked at the group. 6 adults, all haggard, all barely on their feet. 9 children ranging from toddlers to early adolescents, their faces streaked with dust, their clothes torn, their bodies running on the last fumes of endurance. The children stared at her with wide eyes, Kethari eyes, lavender and silver and amber, and she saw in them the same look she'd seen on 42 faces in a creche 12 years ago. She would not fail them, not again, not these. "Single file," she said. "Adults carry the small ones, step exactly where I step, not beside my tracks, not near them, in them. If the scanner beeps twice, everyone freezes. 3 beeps, everyone gets down flat. Understood?" Torath relayed the instructions. The group assembled. Vetha lifted the smallest child, a Kethari girl with mint-green skin and enormous amber eyes, her silver hair tangled with dust, and settled her on her hip. The child weighed almost nothing. She smelled like ash and fear and something sweet, the way all small children smell, regardless of species. She looked up at Vetha with that universal expression, part confusion, part question, part desperate hope that this tall person knew what she was doing. "I've got you," Vetha said. They walked. The scanner beeped twice at 70 meters out and everyone froze. Vetha shifted the sweep. Subsurface ordnance, 3 meters to the left. She adjusted the path. They walked on. It beeped again at 120 meters. Another ordnance reading, this one directly ahead. Vetha stopped. Felt the sweat running down her spine, felt the child on her hip grip her collar with small fingers. She swept wide. Found a clean path 2 meters to the right, redirected the column. 150 meters, 175. The child on Vetha's hip had wrapped both arms around her neck and buried her face against Vetha's collarbone. Her breathing was fast and shallow, not panic, just the rapid respiration of a small body running on adrenaline and trust. "Almost there," Vetha murmured, "almost." Behind her, the column was holding. Torath was at the rear, carrying one of the other small children, his steps precise and careful. The adults moved in silence. The older children held hands, each one stepping into the footprint of the person ahead with the grim concentration of people who understood, even at their age, that the dust beneath them held things that could end them. At 190 meters, the scanner let out a single long tone, a reading Vetha had never heard before. She stopped. The display showed a dense cluster of subsurface objects directly in their path, 6 meters wide, extending in both directions. Not individual mines. A belt. A defensive line. Someone had seeded the entire approach to the corridor with ordnance, probably during the final retreat. The column stood frozen in the dark. 15 people and 6 adults, breathing in unison, waiting. Vetha swept left. The belt extended. She swept right. It extended. There was no way around. But the scanner showed varying depths. Some of the ordnance was buried deep, 2 or 3 meters down, too deep for surface pressure to trigger, if she could find a section where the shallow mines had gaps. There, a 3-meter-wide section where the shallowest ordnance was at 1.4 meters. Still risky, still unknown. But the deepest section of the belt, and the only one where footsteps on the surface had a reasonable chance of passing without reaching the pressure thresholds. Reasonable, not certain, reasonable. Vetha adjusted the column's path. Light steps, she told Toreth, as light as you can. Don't shift your weight suddenly. Don't stop in the middle. Walk through, steadily. They walked through. 10 seconds of crossing. 10 seconds where the ground beneath them held things designed to shatter bodies, and all that stood between those things and these people was 2 meters of compressed ash and the engineering tolerances of weapons that were 12 years old and corroding. The ground held, the column passed. The safe corridor was visible ahead now, the yellow markers catching the crawler's headlamps, glowing like small suns in the dark. Colm was standing on the running board of the crawler, holding the handheld beacon from the emergency kit. The small blue light pulsed in his hand, steady as a heartbeat, guiding them in. She had told him to stay inside. He had not stayed inside. This way, Colm called, his voice carrying clear across the last meters of dark ground. This way, I can see you. They made the corridor. All of them, 6 adults, 9 children, 1 Kethari woman with blistered arms and a nightmare she carried like a stone, and 1 human boy standing on a running board with a light in his hands and a boot under his arm. The crawler was not designed for 23 people. It didn't matter. They packed in children on laps, adults against walls, supplies redistributed, water rationed, the heating system cranked to compensate for the body heat pushing the temperature differential. Colm surrendered his sleeping nook to the 2 smallest children and curled up instead on the floor of the cockpit, at Vetha's feet, wrapped in his blanket with Sergeant as a pillow. Navigator should sleep, Vetha told him. Navigator sleeps when the mission's done, he replied, and was asleep within 30 seconds. He slept like all children sleep after a crisis. Instantly, deeply, completely, as though the body had decided on his behalf that everything was fine now and rest was more important than vigilance. Vetha drove south through the rest of the night and into the morning. Behind her, the cargo bay was silent except for the breathing of 15 rescued people and the occasional murmur of a child dreaming. Rahel had taken over scanner duty, her ankle propped up, her eyes steady on the display. Toreth sat beside her, feeding coordinates. By noon they had cleared the hollows. The vegetation line appeared again, the blue-leaved scrub thicker now, spreading out from the dry riverbed into actual stands of growth. Trees, real trees with trunks and branches and leaves that moved in the wind. Colm woke when the light changed. He climbed up to the viewport and looked out at the spreading blue canopy, and his face did something that Vetha would remember for the rest of her life. It opened. That was the only word for it. His face opened like a flower, like a door, like a hand unclenching, and what was inside was pure, undiluted wonder. "Trees," he whispered. "So many trees." Behind them in the cargo bay, one of the Kethari children, the mint-green girl, the one Vetha had carried on her hip, appeared at the cockpit entrance. She was holding Sergeant. She held the boot out toward Colm with both hands, the way you return something precious that you've been entrusted with. "Your friend," she said in careful Kethari. Colm took the boot, looked at the girl, smiled that sudden light smile. "Sergeant says thank you for keeping him warm." The girl's amber eyes went wide. She looked at the boot. She looked at Colm. And then she smiled back, tentative, uncertain, but real, and Vetha watched two children from two different worlds recognize each other as the same thing. Small, surviving, and capable of joy despite everything. The road to Kethari's city improved as they descended from the plains. The dry riverbed filled with water, actual flowing water, clear and cold, and the vegetation thickened into forest. Blue-leaved trees rose on either side of the track, their canopy filtering the light into a shifting mosaic of cerulean and gold. The air changed, too, warmer, moister, carrying the scent of growing things. Combe kept a running commentary from the co-pilot's seat. There's a bird, there's another bird, there's a thing that might be a bird but has too many wings. Vetha, how many wings is normal?
For which species? Any species.
2, usually.
That one has 6.
Then it's overachieving. Rahul laughed from the cargo bay. Torath, who had been stoic and silent for most of the journey, allowed himself a small smile. The children had migrated to the viewports, pressing their faces against the glass, and the cargo bay had filled with the sound of small voices cataloging every tree, every animal, every patch of sky visible through the canopy. Innocence, Vetha thought. It should have been destroyed by now. By the war, the displacement, the bombing, the mined wastelands, the 2 days of huddling in a collapsed bunker. It should have been burned away like the creche on Vethara Prime, reduced to ash and silence. But it hadn't been. It was here, in the cargo bay of a battered transport crawler, in the voices of children pointing at birds with too many wings, in a human boy holding a boot, and a Kethari girl with mint-green skin, sitting side by side at a viewport, navigating together toward a city neither of them had ever seen. That was the thing about children. You could take everything from them, their homes, their families, their worlds, and they would still find something to marvel at. A blue tree, a 6-winged bird, a boot named Sergeant. The thing that burned could not, apparently, be burned. They reached the outskirts of Kethari's city by evening. The city appeared gradually. First the outlying farms, their blue-leaf fields stretching in neat rows. Then the first buildings, low and stone-built with curved roofs. Then the streets, busy with foot traffic and ground vehicles, the buildings growing taller and closer together until the skyline solidified into something approaching a metropolis. Vetha had been here before the war. It had been a city of 2 million then, the administrative capital of the Ash Plains province. Now it was swollen to 4 million with refugees, and the strain showed temporary shelters in every park, queue lines outside every processing center, the quiet tension of too many displaced people in too small a space. She drove the crawler to the provisional processing hub, a sprawling complex of prefab buildings near the city center, flags of 6 species flying from its roof. The crawler drew stares as it rolled through the gate. An 18-ton cargo vehicle disgorging 22 passengers, most of them children, was apparently not a common sight. The processing staff met them at the ramp. Medics took the injured adults and the smallest children. Social workers appeared with blankets and nutrient bars. A woman with a clipboard began taking names and cross-referencing them against the convoy's manifest, matching children to records, records to families. Combe stood at Vetha's side through all of it, holding Sergeant, watching the controlled chaos with his dark, steady eyes. The mint-green Kethari girl, whose name it turned out was Luraith, stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. A voice cut through the noise. Excuse me, you're the Kethari contractor, the one with the human child." The speaker was a human woman in a crisp blue jacket with the insignia of the Human Consular Service. She was short, dark-haired, efficient-looking, and she was holding a datapad with Combe's name on it. Vetha could read it from 3 meters away because the font was very large and very red. "I'm Liaison Marin Cho," the woman said, extending her hand in the human fashion. Vetha took it. The woman's grip was firm and businesslike. "We received a flag from Urith for processing." A human minor in alien temporary custody, transit paperwork filed under emergency provisions. She looked at Combe. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm from the human office. We've been looking for you." Combe looked at Marin Cho the way he looked at terrain features he was evaluating, carefully, without commitment, reserving judgment. "I'm not lost," he said. "Of course not." Marin Cho's smile was professional, practiced. The smile of someone who had delivered reassurance to displaced children so many times that it had become a reflex. "But we need to get you registered. There might be family members looking for you. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, anyone from Senna 9 who made it out." Something flickered across Combs' face. Not hope, something more guarded than hope. Something that had learned to protect itself. "There isn't anyone," he said, flat certain. "You'd be surprised. The reunification database is updated daily. We've matched hundreds of families in the last month alone." Marin Cho looked at Vetha. Her expression was polite but unmistakable in its message. This is a human child and humans handle human children. "We have a facility here. Building 7. Clean beds, human food, other human children. He'll be comfortable while we search the database and arrange a placement." "A placement," Vetha repeated. "A human foster family, or a group home depending on availability. The system works, Ms. Vetha." "Ms. Vetha, the system works. We've placed over 3,000 unaccompanied human minors since the ceasefire." Vetha looked at Combe. The boy was standing very still, his hand resting on her wrist, that light gravitational hold. His face was composed. He was watching Marin Cho the way a small animal watches a hawk, not with panic, but with the still, alert attention of someone calculating distances. "He'll need to come with me now," Marin Cho said gently. "The sooner we start the process." "Can I have a moment?" Vetha said. Marin Cho hesitated. Protocol said no. Protocol said unaccompanied minors in alien custody should be transferred to species-appropriate care immediately. But something in Vetha's face, or perhaps something in the way the boy's fingers rested on her wrist, made the woman nod. "5 minutes, I'll be in building 7. She walked away. Vetha crouched. Combe looked at her. "She wants to take me to the human place." "She does. Are you going to let her?" The question hit like the third beep of the terrain scanner, the one that meant get down flat, danger is here, and there is nothing between you and it. "Combe," she said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly, not what you think I want to hear, honestly." "Okay. Do you remember your family, on Senna?" The stillness deepened. Combs' hand left her wrist. He looked down at Sargent, who was tucked under his arm, and his thumb rubbed the scrap of cloth wrapped around the boot's upper, back and forth, a self-soothing rhythm. "My mom," he said, "she had dark hair, she smelled like the greenhouse. She could carry 2 water tanks at the same time." He paused. "The evacuation ship was full. She put me on, she didn't get on." Vetha's breath stopped. "I watched through the window," Combs said. "She waved. She was smiling. She wanted me to think it was okay." Another pause longer. "It wasn't okay." "No," Vetha said, "it wasn't. But it's okay now." He looked up. "Because you're here and you come back when you say you will." Vetha stood. She took his hand. She walked to the complex directory posted on the wall and found Building 7. Then she looked past it. "We need to find the human liaison office," she said. "It's in Building 7. Combe didn't move. He looked up at her. "Do we have to go now?" "The sooner we get you registered, the sooner they can find a placement for you." "I don't want a placement." Vetha crouched. She didn't have to crouch far, she was tall, but Combe had grown in the 3 weeks since she'd collected him from the intake hall on Ureth 4. He was taller. His face was thinner, though not underfed. He looked like a child who had been traveling, who had been in motion, who had been somewhere and done something that most adults would never do. "Combe," she said, "I'm a transport contractor. I live in a crawler. I eat tava root 3 meals a day. I don't like tava root. I don't have a fixed address, I don't have a home, and I don't know anything about raising a human child. You know lots of things, Combs said. You know how to drive in mine places, you know how to carry people, you know how to fix broken ankles, you know which beetles are the loud ones. He paused. You know how to come back when you said you would. Vetha's vision blurred. She blinked, and the blur resolved into the face of a boy who was looking at her the way the children in the creche had looked at her. Not with need, not with demand, but with the simple, devastating certainty that she was the person who would keep them safe. The difference was that this time, the child was not behind a burning door. This time, the child was right here, standing in front of her, holding a boot, asking to stay. I have nightmares, she said. It came out before she could stop it. I know, Combs said. You make sounds. I put the blanket closer so you're warm. She stared at him. 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, this boy had been awake when her nightmares came, and instead of being frightened, instead of calling for help, he had crept to her bedroll and adjusted her blanket. You are not making this decision easier, she said. I'm not trying to make it easier. I'm trying to make it right. Vetha stayed crouched. She looked at this small human being, this tiny person who had been displaced from his world, processed through a system, assigned a number, placed in a queue, and who had responded to all of it by naming a boot, befriending beetles, and navigating a Kethari woman through a desert by pointing out the window and saying, "That way." She thought about the creche, about the 31 names she carried, about the fact that she had spent 12 years running from the sound of children, because she could not bear to hear it and know that she might fail them again. And she thought about what Combs had said on the first night in the plains. I belong with you, stated as fact, like gravity, like water finding its level, like something that just was. She stood up, took his hand, walked past Building 7. Marin Cho was standing in the doorway of Building 7 when they passed. She saw them. She saw the direction they were heading. She opened her mouth, and then she looked at Combs' hand in Vetha's hand, at the way the boy was matching his stride to the Kethari woman's stride, small steps beside long ones, the two of them moving together with the synchronized ease of people who had been walking the same road for a long time. Marin Cho closed her mouth. She looked at her datapad. She looked at the pair walking away from her. And then she did something that was not in any protocol manual. She tapped a code into the datapad, cleared the red flag from Combs' file, and typed a single note in the remarks field. Family located. Case closed. Where are we going? Combs asked. Building 3, Vetha said. That's the family registration office. Combs looked up at her. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He didn't cheer. What he did was tighten his grip on her hand, not hard, not desperate, just certain, and match his stride to hers. Moving together through the crowd, heading toward a building where a document could be signed that would make temporary into permanent. Rahel was waiting at the crawler when they came back an hour later. She was sitting on the running board, her splinted ankle stretched out in front of her, watching the evening light turn the stone buildings gold. Building 7, she asked. Building 3, Vetha said. Rahel nodded slowly. She looked at Combs, who was standing beside Vetha with Sargent under one arm and a new piece of paper in his other hand. A paper covered in official stamps and signatures, and the words provisional custody, extended term in bold Kethari script. That's not a transport document, Rahel said. No, Vetha said, it's not. Combs held up the paper for Rahel's inspection. I'm staying, he said. Vetha and I are a convoy now. Rahel laughed. It was the full, unguarded laugh of someone who has survived something terrible and found, against all expectation, something worth laughing about on the other side of it. You'll need more than one cracker for the beetles, she said. I know, Combs said. I've been thinking about that. They spent the night in the crawler, parked in the processing hub's vehicle bay. It was the first night in a week that Vetha hadn't driven through darkness, and the stillness felt strange, too quiet, too stable, as though the world had stopped moving and she didn't know how to be still inside it. She lay on her bedroll and waited for the nightmare. It came as it always did, the smoke, the heat, the door buckling inward. But this time something was different. This time in the dream she reached the door. She opened it, and on the other side there was no fire. Just a small boy sitting on the floor, watching a cleaning drone navigate around his knees, looking up at her with dark, steady eyes. "Just a bump," the boy in the dream said. Vetha woke with her hand on her sternum, her pulse steady, her eyes dry. In the sleeping nook behind her, Combe was breathing the deep, slow breaths of a child who slept without fear. Sargent was propped upright on the crate beside him, hooded in his scrap of cloth, standing guard. She closed her eyes and slept again. No smoke this time, no fire. Just the hum of the crawler and the sound of breathing, and the knowledge settled deep, like a bone in its socket, that she had not failed. Not this time. Not this child. In the morning, Combe drew a new picture on the viewport with his charcoal. The same procession as before, a tall figure, a small figure, a boot, but this time there were more. Small figures with pointed ears and wide eyes, a woman with a splinted ankle, a line of travelers stretching across the glass, all heading in the same direction. At the front of the procession, the tall figure and the small figure were holding hands. "Where are we going?" Vetha asked, looking at the picture. Combe thought about it. He thought about it for a long time, with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that some questions were important enough to answer carefully. "Forward," he said. The crawler's engine started. The vehicle bay doors opened onto morning light, bright, clean, golden, pouring through the streets of Kethari city and turning every surface to warmth. The blue trees along the avenue were moving in a gentle wind, their leaves catching the light and scattering it in shifting patterns across the road. Vetha put the crawler in gear. Combe sat in the co-pilot's seat, Sargent on his lap, eyes on the road ahead. Behind them, the processing hub shrank in the rear viewport, and ahead, the road stretched out through the city and beyond it, into green country, into blue forests, into whatever came next. They drove into the morning. A Kethari woman with blistered arms and a borrowed child. A human boy with a boot, and an unshakable conviction that belonging was not about species or paperwork or the shape of your ears. A crawler that smelled like sand beetles and tava root, and the burnt metal scent of a fire that had finally, after 12 years, begun to go out. Forward together, into whatever came next. And from the co-pilot's seat, very quietly, the boy began to hum along with the engine. The comm unit crackled before they'd cleared the city limits. Vetha almost didn't answer. But the frequency was authority dispatch, and ignoring authority dispatch was the kind of thing that got your fuel allocation revoked. She keyed the comm. "Vetha, transport contractor, license 37 Alpha, go ahead." "Ms. Vetha, this is dispatch coordinator Holan at the Kethari's provisional hub. We show you transported 15 additional refugees into the hub last night. The authority has flagged your file for commendation review." Vetha's hand tightened on the steering column. Another commendation, another medal to shove under the socks. "I don't need a commendation. I need a fuel allocation extension. My reserves are at 31%. "Noted, Ms. Vetha, there's a secondary matter. We have a transport request. Refugee convoy, 47 individuals, 18 unaccompanied minors. They're stalled at Relay Point Echo, 90 kilometers north. Transport broke down, non-repairable. They need extraction before the next storm cycle, approximately 36 hours. 47 people, 18 children, 90 kilometers north, which meant backtracking into the transitional zone where the blue trees gave way to scrubland and the scrubland gave way to ash. "My crawler seats 4, Vetha said, comfortably. "Your crawler held 23 last night. The manifest says so." "That was not comfortable." I imagine it was not, but we don't have another vehicle for at least 4 days. Vetha rubbed her forehead. She looked at Combe. The boy was watching her with that steady gaze, and there was something in his expression, not expectation, not pressure, just quiet recognition. He already knew what she was going to say. "Send me the coordinates," Vetha said. "Transmitting now, dispatch out." The nav console chirped. 93 kilometers along a road that was half paved and half suggestion. Vetha plotted the route, checked her fuel 31%, tight but possible, and turned the crawler north. Combe settled back into his seat. He adjusted Sargent on his lap, positioning the boot so it faced the viewport. "Sargent needs to see where we're going," he explained. "Of course he does." "How many kids?" 18. Combe processed this number with visible seriousness. "We'll need more blankets. And crackers, definitely more crackers. We're not feeding sand beetles to 18 children, Combe." "The crackers aren't for the sand beetles. The sand beetles eat silica dust," you said. "Then who are the crackers for?" "The children like crackers. I'm an expert." Vetha almost smiled. The almost was becoming a habit, a slow erosion of the wall she'd built between herself and anything that resembled warmth. They drove north. The blue forest thinned until the last tree stood alone at the edge of a bare slope like a sentinel watching the wasteland. Beyond it, the transitional zone, thin soil and scattered rock, not quite the ash plains but no longer anything green. Combe narrated the transition. "Trees are getting shorter, now they're bushes, now they're just sticks. Now there's nothing." He paused. "Wait, there's a rock, it's shaped like Sargent." Vetha glanced at the rock. It was shaped nothing like a boot. "I see the resemblance," she said. They reached Relay Point Echo in just under 3 hours. The convoy was visible from 2 kilometers out, a cluster of dark shapes against the pale ground, surrounding a broken transport vehicle listing on a shattered axle. Tents ringed the vehicle in a rough semicircle, and figures moved between them with the tired, organized stillness of people who had been waiting and were very good at it. A Joruvan man met the crawler at the perimeter, tall, taller than Vetha, with all 4 arms folded across his chest. "You're the extraction?" he asked. "I'm what they sent." He looked at the crawler. He looked at the 47 people behind him. "That's going to be tight." "I've heard that before." His name was Davin. He'd been leading this group for 11 days out of the northern settlement of Korath. The transport had held together until yesterday, when the rear axle cracked and the hydraulic system bled out. "The real problem is the children," Davin said, lowering his voice. "Some of them haven't spoken since we left Korath. The ones separated from parents, they just go quiet. You can feed them, keep them warm, but they don't talk." Vetha knew that silence. She'd heard it in the creche in the hours before the bombing, when the children sensed something wrong before the adults did and went still. "We'll get them to Kethari's," she said. "All of them." Loading 47 people into a crawler designed for 4 was an exercise in spatial reasoning. Davin's adults dismantled the tents for padding. Supply crates became tiered seating. Combe directed the smaller children into the sleeping nook with the authority of someone who knew its exact dimensions. "Feet go that way," he told a Kethari boy who was approximately his own age. "Head goes this way. If you put Sargent between you and the wall, you don't bonk." "Who's Sargent?" the boy asked. Combe held up the boot. The boy stared at it. "That's a boot." "That's Sargent. He's been across the ash plains through the hollows and past a minefield. Show some respect." The boy, whose name was Kale, looked at the boot with renewed consideration. "Does he talk?" "Not to everyone. You have to earn it." Within 10 minutes, Kale and Combe were deep in conversation, Sargent propped between them. 3 other children joined, drawn by the gravitational pull that children exert on each other in confined spaces, and the sleeping nook became a small, warm ecosystem of whispered negotiations and shared blankets. One of the quiet ones, a Joruvan girl, maybe 4 years old with mottled blue-gray skin and all 4 of her small arms wrapped around her own knees, sat at the edge of the group, watching but not joining. Her mouth stayed closed. Colm noticed. He always noticed. He didn't push. He just shifted sideways, closing the gap, and placed Sargent on the floor between them where she could see the boot without having to ask. After 5 minutes, one of her small hands crept out and touched Sargent's toe. She didn't say anything, but she touched the boot and she didn't pull her hand back. Vetha saw it from the cockpit doorway. She turned away before anyone could see her face. The drive south was slow and loud. Davin sat behind Vetha's seat, calling out road conditions. Colm remained in the sleeping nook, where he had apparently established a small republic of children governed by rules he was inventing on the spot. Rule 1, she heard him say as they crested a ridge. If the crawler bumps, you hold on to the person next to you. Rule 2, Sargent is in charge when I'm not here. Rule 3. You're always here, Kale pointed out. Rule 3, Colm continued undeterred, is that nobody has to talk if they don't want to. Quiet is okay. Sargent is quiet and he's the bravest person I know. The Joruvan girl's hand was still on Sargent's toe. Her grip had tightened. She was looking at Colm with an expression that Vetha recognized, had seen in her own mirror, had felt in her own chest. The expression of someone who had been given permission to be exactly what they were, without apology, without performance. The storm came faster than forecast. They were 40 kilometers from Kethari when the western horizon darkened and the wind picked up, carrying the first gritty whisper of dust. Vetha pushed the crawler to maximum safe speed and watched the storm front close the distance behind them. "We're not going to outrun it," Davin said quietly. "We don't need to outrun it. We need to reach the tree line." The crawler groaned up to 30 kilometers per hour, the chassis rattling, the engine straining. In the cargo bay, Davin called for everyone to hold on. The children went silent, the focused silence of children who had been through enough to know that when adults said hold on, you held on. Colm appeared in the cockpit doorway, bracing himself against the frame. He didn't sit down when she told him to. He stood watching the viewport, where the tree line was visible now, a dark blue band growing closer. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, come on." The first blast hit them at 12 kilometers out. The crawler shuddered, slewed sideways, and Vetha fought the steering column with both hands. Dust hammered the viewport. Visibility dropped to 10 meters. She drove by instruments alone, the distance counter ticking down 10, 8, 6, 4, while the storm screamed around them. At 2 kilometers, the first trees appeared, ghostly blue shapes bending in the wind but holding. The crawler entered the tree line and the violence dropped by half. Vetha stopped in a clearing, deployed the anchor spikes, killed the engine, and sat breathing. Behind her, the cargo bay erupted in applause, 47 people, the sound mixing with laughter and relief, and the high, clear voices of children who had just learned they were going to be okay. Colm was still in the cockpit doorway, not clapping, looking at Vetha with an expression she had never seen on a 6-year-old's face, pride. The pride of a person who has chosen someone to believe in and been proven right. "Good driving," he said. "Good navigating." The storm passed by morning. They reached Kethari City 2 hours after dawn, rolling through the processing hub gates for the second time in 2 days, disgorging 47 exhausted, dust-caked, alive people onto the loading ramp. Davin shook Vetha's hand at the ramp, all 4 of his. "If you ever need anything," he said, "anything at all. I need a fuel allocation extension." "I meant something emotional. Fuel is very emotional to me right now." He laughed and led his people into the processing hall. The children filed past the crawler in a line, Kale waving at Colm, the other sleeping nook children calling goodbye. The quiet Joruvan girl walking with her small hands at her sides and her eyes forward, still not speaking, but walking on her own, moving forward under her own power, which was its own kind of language. As she passed the crawler's ramp, the Joruvan girl stopped. She turned. She looked up at Combe, who was sitting on the running board with Sergeant on his knee. She didn't speak, but she raised one of her 4 small hands and waved, a single, slow wave, careful and deliberate, as though she had thought about it for a long time and decided that this was worth the effort. Combe waved back. "Sergeant says goodbye," he said. "And that you're very brave." The girl's mouth moved. No sound came out, but the shape of it, the careful formation of lips around an unfamiliar word, looked like it might have been trying to be thank you. She turned and followed the others inside. Combe watched her go. Then he looked up at Vetha, who was standing beside the crawler with engine grease on her hands and dust in her silver hair, and something in her chest that felt less like a weight and more like an anchor. Not the kind that holds you down, but the kind that holds you steady. "Vetha," he said, "are we going to do this again?" "Do what?" "Go get people, bring them here. Through the bad parts." She looked at him, this small, extraordinary human being who had walked into her life through a crack in the bureaucracy and refused to leave, who had taught a Kethari woman with blistered arms and a 12-year nightmare that the thing about children was not that they needed saving. It was that they saved you right back. "Yes," she said, "I think we are." Combe nodded. He walked to the co-pilot's seat, buckled the oversized harness, and adjusted Sergeant to face the viewport. "Navigators ready," he said. Vetha climbed into the pilot's seat. The authority channel was already chirping. Another convoy, another cluster of heat signatures in the waste, another group of people waiting for someone to come. She keyed the comm. "Vetha, transport contractor, license 37 Alpha. Send me the coordinates." She put the crawler in gear. "Forward?" she asked. Combe smiled, that sudden light smile, the one that had no business existing in a universe this broken, and yet existed anyway, persistent and defiant and unburnable. "Forward," he said. And they drove.